Welcome back to History Morsels. In our first visits, we've met presidents and preachers and talked a little bit about explorers like Christopher Columbus and Lewis and Clark, who explored the Louisiana Purchase. Their expedition ended in 1806. 14 years later, in 1820, explorers set their sights on another recently discovered land at the bottom of the earth, Antarctica. Adventurers from many countries rushed to the unexplored continent, eager to become the first man to arrive at the South Pole. The next 100 years would become known as the heroic age of Antarctic exploration. I'd like to introduce you to three of these explorers, beginning with my favorite explorer, Ernest Shackleton. Ernest Shackleton was born in February 1874 in Ireland. The family eventually moved to London, where young Ernest went to school. He should have been a good student. He was very intelligent and loved to read poetry, science, and history. He especially loved adventure stories. But he wasn't a good student. While he should have been listening in class, he was always dreaming of the day he could become an explorer himself. When he was 16, he dropped out of school, joined the Merchant Navy, and got a job on a cargo ship. 8 years later, he was certified as a master and qualified to command his own ship. When the Royal Geographic Society in London sponsored an expedition to Antarctica, Shackleton signed up. He got a job on the ship Discovery, commanded by Robert Falcon Scott. The Discovery set sail in 1901. They arrived in Antarctica and spent the long winter there. The sun did not shine for 6 months, and the temperature would reach 40 degrees below zero. In the spring, when the sun returned, they set out for the South Pole. But they did not make it. Robert Scott had brought dogs to pull the sledges, which carried their equipment and supplies, but had not trained the dogs how to pull, or his men about how to use the dogs and take care of them. So the men ended up dragging the sledges, with harnesses strapped over their shoulders and around their waists. This was called man-hauling. The work was so hard, the men needed more food to keep up their strength, but instead they ate less, so they would have enough food for the journey back to their ship. Less than halfway to the South Pole, they had to turn back. Shackleton was very ill with scurvy. Scurvy is a disease many sailors and explorers had to face at that time. It was a painful illness caused by a lack of vitamin C and led to loose teeth, bleeding gums, skin problems, and aching joints. They arrived back at their camp in February. Scott sent Shackleton home on a relief ship. They did not reach the South Pole on that expedition, but came closer than anyone had before. Shackleton arrived at home in 1903. He got married and tried several jobs, but he could not stop thinking about Antarctica. In 1906, he began planning another expedition, and this time he was going to command it himself. The next year, he returned to Antarctica on the ship Nimrod. Shackleton and his men started toward the South Pole again. After 24 days, he passed the mark Scott had reached in 1902, but he was facing the same problems as last time: bad weather and too little food. Less than 100 miles from the pole, Shackleton decided to turn back. His men were hungry and exhausted. If they continued, they would face starvation. His men's lives were more important to him than the goal. The South Pole was still a prize to be won, and Robert Scott had not given up his dream either. In 1910, he set sail on the Terra Nova, headed back to Antarctica. But he wasn't the only one on his way to the South Pole. An explorer from Norway named Roald Amundsen was also on his way there. Both Scott and Amundsen reached Antarctica and set up winter base camps. Amundsen had an advantage over Scott from the very beginning. His camp was 60 miles closer to the South Pole. He used well-trained dogs to pull his sleds instead of his men. He and his team were from Norway, were excellent skiers, and used to being in the cold and snow. Amundsen reached the South Pole on December 14, 1911, weeks ahead of Scott. When Scott and his men arrived at the pole, they found a note from Amundsen and extra provisions he had left behind. They were devastated. On their return trip, the weather turned bad. They ran out of food. Every one of the 5 men on the team died and were not found till the next summer. Still, Ernest Shackleton longed to return to Antarctica. Since the South Pole had been reached, he set a new goal of crossing the entire continent of Antarctica. In 1913, he announced the Imperial Trans-Antarctic Expedition, bought a ship he named Endurance, and hired a crew. November 1914, they arrived at a whaling station on an island named South Georgia. The whalers warned Shackleton the ice was bad that year, but Shackleton proceeded anyway. They spent 6 weeks zigzagging their ship through the ice, but by early 1915, the Endurance was trapped, still 60 miles from land. Drifting with the ice, the ship was slowly being crushed. Eventually, the ice broke through the sides of the ship, and the ship began to leak. They took their provisions and moved on to the floating ice. 10 months later, the ship sank. They had 3 rescue boats, but the ice was too thick for the men to launch them, so they spent 5 more months camping, living off seals and penguins. When a crack finally opened in the ice, the men set sail in 3 lifeboats in search of land. Captain Frank Worsley navigated with his sextant. A sextant is an instrument which measures the distance between 2 objects, such as the sun and the horizon. He guided them safely to Elephant Island in 6 days. It was the first time in a year and a half they had set foot on solid land. The ship's carpenter, James McNish, built a cover over one of the lifeboats. Shackleton left Frank Wild in charge of the new camp, and with 5 other men set out to get help at South Georgia, 800 miles away. Again, Captain Worsley used his sextant to chart their course. His directions led them safely to South Georgia. It took 17 days. But they were on the opposite side of the island from the whaling station, still more than 100 miles away. Shackleton decided to cross the island on foot. They had to climb tall mountains to reach the other side of the island. Shackleton and 2 other men started across the island. After 36 hours, far in the distance, they heard a steam whistle from the whaling station. They had reached safety. Shackleton immediately began planning a way to return to Elephant Island, but the weather was bad and he could not sail for months. When the weather cleared and he sailed back to Elephant Island, he found all the men he had left behind were alive and well. Shackleton safely delivered his crew home to England 2 years after they left. He tried one more time to get back to Antarctica in 1921. He made it as far as South Georgia, but suffered a heart attack and died at age 48. His widow requested that he be buried on the island. Did you learn a new word today? What causes scurvy? What does a sextant do? When did Amundsen reach the South Pole? One of the reasons we have so much information about the Endurance is due to the work of photographer Frank Hurley. He documented the entire expedition. Many books and online resources feature photos and film of the Endurance and her remarkable crew. There are several reasons Roald Amundsen's expedition was successful. and Robert Scott's ended so badly. You'll find more information about the Terra Nova expedition in the study guide that comes with this episode. It's on my website. Look under History Morsels at hollybebernitz.com. See you next time for another History Morsel, when we'll talk about another kind of adventurer. These explorers didn't travel by ship. They traveled by train.